Is race still a factor when it comes to the college admissions process? Last June, a 6-3 landmark ruling, the Supreme Court of Justice, or SCOTUS, decided that affirmative action and race is no longer a factor when it comes to the college admissions process. But is that really true? And for some context, I've been a college admissions consultant for over 15 years. I'm the founder and CEO of Admission Site. I graduated the bachelor's from Princeton, and we've guided thousands of students to navigate the college admissions process to get their dream schools, especially as it pertains to the Ivy League, Stanford, MIT, U Chicago, and Caltech. So is race still an important factor when it comes to the college admissions process? Yes and no. I can tell you for top schools like Berkeley and UCLA and the UCs, race is not really a factor, right? And I know this because almost 40 to 50% of the student body is Asian, right? If we were to evaluate applicants objectively, which is really based on their GPA and their test scores and based on merit and their extracurricular activities, I have to say most of the student body is going to be Asian, at least half. Because Asians, they just tend to have higher GPA and test scores. And this is just by a purely objective measure. I'm not saying this because I'm Chinese or Asian, or I would still say the same thing if I were white, black, or Hispanic, because race should not be a part of the equation. I'm really just looking at GPA, I'm looking at the test scores, I'm looking at the percentile of racial ethnicities that accomplish these test scores. And if we evaluate based on just pure quantitative metrics, well, I will say Asians should formulate most of the student, at least half the student body. Now, obviously, if you're pushing for a diversity issue, that's a totally different conversation to have. But if we're looking at academics, your transcript, your test scores, and your extracurricular activities, well, I have to say, Asians tend to perform better than other races, all else being equal. Now, of course, I'm not saying that half of the student body should be Asian, because I do think there is merit when it comes to a diverse student body, but at the end of the day, we're talking about academics here, right? And so, obviously, if you're, focusing on other factors like personal qualities, perhaps, even though I still think how do you measure personal qualities, right? That's still a very subjective measure. The college admissions process in these other countries is totally different, right? You take an exam, you do well on the exam, and they literally just rank you, right? In South Korea, you take something called the CSAT, right? And to get into Seoul National University, you have to take the CSAT, and if you do well on the CSAT, then you get into SNU. Or in India, for the IITs, do well on the JEEs, then you get into a great IIT, and it's purely based on your test scores. And the same is for China as well. But when it comes to the college admissions process in the US, it's completely different. So is race, back to the original question, is race still a factor when it comes to college admissions? I do think so, okay? I still think race is a factor when it comes to college admissions, despite the SCOTUS landmark ruling, primarily because if race wasn't a factor, then you would simply see more Asians at these schools, which is not, right? However, I do think there has been a greater push toward admitting more Asian applicants. For example, Harvard, historically, about 20% of the student body were Asian, but now it's like 30% of the student body are Asian now. And same with Stanford, right? That number has risen significantly to 27-30% of the student body are Asian. Whereas schools like Berkeley and UCLA, almost 50% of the school are Asian. So that must mean that race cannot be a factor. And again, I'm basing it purely on objective measures based on the GPA and test scores and the extracurricular activities. Now, a big part of my strategy, and I'll be honest here, right? We've helped a lot of applicants get into the Ivy League schools. I went to an Ivy League myself, and I have to say, I actually try to make my students appear less Asian, I mean, there's a reason why, AP European history is part of the college admissions curriculum, and, no such thing as AP Chinese history, right? But granted, I understand why that would be the case too, because obviously, the Pilgrims all came from Europe when they settled in the US. And so we had to study things like AP European history, we, study AP US history, and that's all fine and dandy, right? I think there is, a lot of lessons to be learned when studying for AP US history. But at the end of the day, if I were to create an application, and if I were to create the best application to give myself and my students the best shot at getting in, I would try to make them appear less Asian, right? I wouldn't talk about, Chinese traditions or joining the Chinese cultural club, because none of these things help when it comes to college admissions. Now, on the flip side, if I talk about like Greco-Roman history and I talk about philosophy like Aristotle and Plato, that actually enhances their odds of getting into a top college. Especially if you're going to be a male applicant who's a philosophy major, right? And granted, a lot of philosophy is based on, is influenced by European culture, at least the way we study it in the US. Is race still a factor? I still think it is. And I did have one student before who was, felt really strongly about his Asian culture. And he wanted to talk about his Asian roots, about, the great immigrant story, encountering challenges as, he moved here to the US with his family, and the struggles and the language barriers that he had to overcome. And this student, don't get me wrong, was super strong. He had a 4.0 GPA, almost a 1600 on the SATs, and had a load of extracurricular activities to boast. And against my advice to appear less Asian in your college applications, because I don't think this immigrant story is going to help you that much when it comes to the college admissions process. But at the same time, he felt strongly about it, right? And I could see why it impacted him personally, right? I mean, it's a big part of his life. Well, needless to say, he applied to all the Ivies, Stanford, MIT, all the top schools. He was rejected everywhere, right? Even if he was such a strong student. And so I'm voicing this to build transparency to my audience here, that I still think race is a factor when it comes to college admissions process. You do want to play your cards strategically, and by appearing less Asian, it actually increases your odds of admission. That's my backdrop against this whole, is race still a factor when it comes to college admissions? I still think it is. I think it's going to be less so with the, SCOTUS decision, now that they're, doing away with affirmative action, so I do think Hispanics and Blacks will more difficult chances of getting in without, affirmative action, historically speaking, obviously. But at the end of the day, don't think race should be used, right? Whether you're Chinese, African, white, Hispanic, it really doesn't matter. We should have a more objective measure determining or admitting applicants, and it shouldn't be a holistic process, right? At the end of the day, this are the cards we're dealt. These are the cards we have to play. And so part of our job here at Admissions Site is maximizing our students' odds of acceptance. And that really means playing all these different strategies, our proprietary strategies, to increase our students' chances of getting in. So that's the whole backdrop. If you like what we say, hit the like and subscribe button. We'll be sharing more tips, advice, and free resources on the college admissions process.